All right. Hi, everybody. We are live on Facebook, I think. We're getting started here. My name is Renee. I work for Girl Scouts here in Nebraska, and we hope you are all safe and healthy, washing your hands and doing everything you can to stop the spread of the virus. We are glad that you are attending and participating in Girl Scouts virtually or by watching this. And I'm excited today to have Katie from the Xerces Society. She's going to talk to us about bees, and she has some information about how to build some things. So if anyone's interested in projects to help support the pollinators in their neighborhood, in their backyard, you might want to pay attention. But I am going to turn it over to her, and we will learn about pollinators. So go ahead, Katie.
All right, thanks, Renee. So my name is Katie Lamke, and I'm a bumblebee conservation specialist with the Xerces Society. And the Xerces Society is a science-based organization that works to conserve invertebrates and the habitat that supports them. So when we talk about invertebrates, we're talking about any animal that doesn't have a backbone. So that includes things like your butterflies, moths, bees. It includes aquatics like freshwater mussels. And what we do to conserve them is we're protecting these species from going extinct. So we're working on restoring habitat or improving habitat that's already on the landscape. And a big part of conservation work is raising awareness with our friends and our coworkers and people maybe that we work with or go to school with, and just to let everybody know what we can do to help pollinators or help butterflies. And we do all of this work for invertebrates because they have a large impact on the world and the way that it works. So when you think about all of the different living species on Earth, 95% of those are made up of invertebrates. So that's including everything from plants like your trees and your flowers, fungi, your small mammals, some of your bigger mammals, fish, birds, anything that's living. 95% of those different species are some type of invertebrate, which is pretty amazing. And our invertebrates help us with decomposition. So that can be like a dung beetle breaking down feces and putting it back into the soil to create nutrients. That can be a wasp or a lady beetle taking on a predatory role where they attack a smaller pest population. Invertebrates also serve as the base of the food chain, right? Many species of fish and birds really rely on insects as a large part of their diet. And particular to what we're going to talk about today, invertebrates supply a lot of pollination services. And some of our main pollinators can include butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. So there's a lot more pollinators than we generally think about. And when we talk about pollination, it's usually done by some type of insect. And they're visiting a flower to collect the nectar and the pollen because that's their main source of food. And then they're going to fly to another flower and they're going to drop off some of those pollen grains. And when the flower receives those pollen grains, it allows the plant to reproduce, right? And when we see plants reproducing, that's when we get things like nuts and seeds and berries and all the delicious things that we like to eat. And so that has a pretty large effect on our ecosystem, right? Because all of the little squirrels are going to be eating those seeds and the birds are going to be eating those seeds. And that's going to work its way all the way up to the food chain to things like deer and grizzly bears. And not only are they getting food from these plants, but these animals are also getting a place to nest, right? So it's really essential that we have pollinators that keep helping those plants reproduce to supply us with those resources. And not only are the plants providing food and shelter for wildlife, but they're also keeping our prairies very healthy, right? With many different types of plants on the landscape. They're taking in CO2 from the atmosphere and putting out oxygen for us to breathe. And their root systems under the soil are really creating a strong system, right? They're holding that soil in place. They're helping to cycle nutrients and keep the soil healthy. The roots are also filtering water, right? So they're keeping our creeks clean. So plants do quite a lot for the ecosystem, and they rely on those pollinators to be able to do that. And pollinators also help supply us with some of our healthy vitamins and minerals, right? So a lot of crops are in need of pollination services. So 35% of the crops worldwide require insect pollination. So that can include things like your tomatoes, peppers, cherries, oranges, even chocolate is pollinated, right? And so there's a pretty large value there. And so if we look at a grocery store, this is what it would look like on a typical day. And if we remove everything in this photo that was pollinated by an insect, it might look a little something like this. Right? So we wouldn't completely starve, but we would certainly lose a lot of those nutritious values foods and some of the things that taste good. So what are we talking about when we talk about wild bees, right? So in the world, there are 20,000 different types of bees out there. And in Nebraska, we think there's about 300 to 400 different species, but nobody really knows the exact number yet because the scientists are still trying to figure out how many different species exist. And the difference between a wild bee and a managed bee, there's a few different things that we're going to go over here. So managed bees are like honeybees, right? They need humans to take care of them, whereas wild bees, they're wildlife, right? So they're more similar to a fox or a deer, something that's out in a natural ecosystem. Whereas honeybees are considered livestock, so they're more similar to a cow or a chicken, right? Somebody is helping maintain them. And honeybees are also non-native to the US. So a lot of the bees that you see flying around on the flowers, those are going to be species that are native. They're from the United States. And another fun fact that people usually don't know is that most of our wild bees don't make honey. So that's kind of a trait specific to honeybees. And honeybees will make a whole bunch of honey as a food storage, right? Because they're living for multiple years. So they build up a lot of food to eat during the winter. But our wild bees don't usually do that because they only live for 1 year at a time. So they have no need to stock up on food to live through the winter. And probably the biggest difference between our wild and our managed bees are that wild bees are solitary and managed bees are social. So when we say honeybees are social, that means that they have many different bees living in the same colony, right? There's a queen bee, there's worker bees, and there's male bees. And they all have their own role, right? They all have something different to do in the colony. So the queen's going to be laying eggs, and your worker bees are going to be taking care of those eggs. They're going to be collecting food resources. But our wild bees are mostly solitary. So there's only one adult bee who lives all by herself. There's no queen, there's no workers, there's no colony. She just has her nest that's usually in the ground. So when we look at some of these ground nesting bees, this is what you might see here. So in the big picture, you can see all these little mounds in the ground. Each one of those is an individual bee nest. So this is kind of like an apartment building, but for bees, right? There's a whole bunch of different bees that all have their own home in a very small area. But not all of our bees like to nest near each other. Sometimes you'll see a bee that's nesting by itself. And all of these holes are very, very tiny to see. But if we go down into the earth and see what they're doing under there, you'll find that bees create these tunnel systems. So they dig down into the earth And then at the bottom, they create these chambers where they're going to lay their eggs. So if we zoom into one of these little chambers, what you're looking at here is a little kind of, it's a little casing that the bees created using some of her saliva and some dirt, and she compacts it. And inside of that chamber, she's collected nectar and pollen and rolled it into a ball. And then on top of that pollen mass, she's going to lay her egg. So if you can see that really small white thing that looks like a grain of rice, that is actually a bee egg. So that egg is going to turn into a larva and consume all of that pollen and nectar. And then she's going to turn into a pupa. And then all through the fall and the winter, this bee is going to spend her time developing. And the following spring, she's going to emerge from that tunnel as an adult bee. So that's the general life cycle for most of our wild bees. And instead of nesting below ground, we also have a lot of bees that will nest above ground. So here we have a leafcutter bee who has collected a small piece of leaf from a plant somewhere, and she's flying it back to her nest. So if any of you have seen those bee blocks or bee nests or bee hotels out on the landscape, it's like a piece of wood with a whole bunch of holes in it. This is what it might look like on the inside. So on the top layer there's a whole bunch of little leaf pieces that the bee has individually collected and brought back to her nest. And similar to the chamber that the bees created underground, they're creating bees, but above ground using leaves. And in the rows below that, instead of using leaves, there was a resin bee. So this bee actually collected a sticky substance that plants create, and she separated her eggs out that way. And in the bottom row, there's a mason bee. So that bee uses mud to create its chambers for the eggs. So lots of different materials that bees will use on the landscape. Then we also have bees that will use tiny grass stems to make their nest in. And so our bees can come in all different types of sizes too. So here we have North America's smallest bee sitting on the face of North America's largest bee. And the largest bee is about 1.5 inches big. So that's about the same size of the first segment on your thumb. They can get pretty big. And to give you another view of that, here is a bee up next to a dime. So most of us probably wouldn't even see this bee because it's so tiny. And if you did, chances are we probably wouldn't recognize it because it's orange, it's not very hairy, probably doesn't have an audible buzz. So bees can look very different. They can be very different sizes, and they can come in all different types of colors. So this is a green metallic sweat bee. And this bee is actually very common in Nebraska, but they're very, very quick. So if you start looking on different flower heads that are blooming right now, you might be lucky enough to see one of these, but you have to be careful where you place your shadow. As soon as your shadow goes over that flower, the bee's going to fly away. We also have big yellow bumblebees that are quite fuzzy. And we have bees that are dark metallic blue. So there's all different kinds of bees out there. And some of the things that we can do to help them at home are provide them with food and nesting sources. And so that's what we're going to talk about now for a couple minutes, is some of the things that we can do right now, wherever we are. So the first thing is to provide food for our bees, right? So they get their main source of food from flowers. They eat the pollen and the nectar, and they bring that back to their nest and raise their young on the same thing. So providing bees with different types of flowers gives them a very nutritious diet, similar to us, how we like to eat different types of food to make sure we get all of our vitamins and minerals. Bees need the same thing. So you can see in this garden here that they have quite a few different types of flowers. And instead of just having different flowers, you want flowers that bloom all across the seasons too, right? So bees are going to be flying in spring and summer and fall. So we need to make sure that we have food for them during all of those seasons. And the best way to get flowers for your home is to visit your local nursery and ask them for some native plants that will help pollinators. And most times they will be able to point you in the right direction. The next thing is to create nesting habitat. And for our below ground nesters, patches of bare soil are perfect for this. So when we look in this photo, you can see a few places where there's some bare ground just worked into the garden. And the ground nesting bees like areas that are undisturbed. There's not going to be a lot of people walking around, not a lot of traffic, just some bare soil that gets some sun during the day. But for our above ground nesting bees, if you take a second and look at this photo, see if you can pick out somewhere that an above ground nesting bee might want to nest.
I see a log in there and some sticks.
Yeah. And some sticks.
Trees, maybe in the tree.
Yeah, well, spot on. You got the log. The log is a very easy way to attract not only bees, but a lot of other insects to provide them with some sort of nesting habitat. So if we zoom in on that log, there are actually 3 bee nests in there. These little tiny holes were probably made by this type of bee that we call Agachlora, which is a green metallic bee that will actually chew into the wood and create her nest in there. Another way that you can do that if you can't leave stumps around is to make your own bee nest, right? You can drill into a log, you can drill into a 2x4, or you can make a stem nest with different pieces of bamboo. Some people like to put their bamboo inside of a wooden box or inside some PVC pipe to sort of protect it from the wind and the rain. And if you're interested in those, there's lots of instructions online on how to start them. I would recommend Googling something like native bee nests and finding out which ones you want to take a look at. So another thing that we can do once we've got our food and nesting resources on the landscape is to put up some sort of sign that says, hey, this is pollinator habitat, and let people know what you're doing and how we can all help the bees, right? Because it's very important to let our friends know so that they can sort of do the same thing. And after that, if you still want to help save the bees and get a little bit more involved, there are a couple of projects in Nebraska that you can join. One of them is using an app called Bumblebee Watch. So once you've got bees starting to come to your yard, you can take pictures of them with a phone or a camera and upload them to the site called Bumblebee Watch. And what that does is it sends the pictures of the bees to somebody like me, and I identify the bee, right? Figure out what kind it is. And then it lets scientists know what kinds of bees we have in Nebraska and what flowers they're using, what time of the year they're out, so that we can really figure out what the bees need in order to best survive. And the second project is the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, which is similar to Bumblebee Watch, but it adds an additional step of doing habitat surveys. So if you go out to a park or a prairie, there's a little survey that you can run to look for bees and flowers, and you report that information back to us, and it helps us conserve the bees in Nebraska. So if we sum up all that we just went over, there's 4 main things that we can do to help the pollinators. And the first one is providing food, right? Bees need different types of flowers, and they need flowers through spring and summer and fall. And the next step would be to create nesting habitat, right? They need somewhere in the soil if they're a ground nesting bee, or somewhere above ground, whether that be a stump or a log or a pile of sticks, building your own bee nest. Once you've got your food and your nesting resources, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell them what you're doing to help the bees and see if they want to get involved too. And the last step is joining a community science project, right? Taking pictures of the bees, really noticing and observing what you're attracting to your garden. And that's all I've got on the bees for today.
All right. So, can you just tell me again how many different kinds of bees we have in Nebraska? I know you mentioned it earlier, but
In Nebraska, we think there's about 300 to 400. Yeah, 20,000
okay.
in the world.
So, how in the past we've had? I'm assuming you've done these bumblebee watch things and the bumblebee atlas in the past. Have you seen those citizen scientist projects discovering new bees in Nebraska? Has that like been growing or?
So in Nebraska, we just started last year, but Nebraska we have 20 different bumblebee species here, 20 different kinds of bumblebees, and 4 of those are listed as species of greatest conservation need. So Nebraska Game and Parks is really paying attention to these species because we know that they need extra help because they are on a path going towards extinction. And last summer, community scientists found 14 different observations of one of those species. So that was exciting to see that bee is all over the state still.
So there were 14 sightings all over the state.
All over the state, yeah, of just one
Okay.
species of it, yeah. But we added almost 700 observations of bumblebees from people submitting photos last year just in Nebraska.
Okay.
So it's very,
cool.
yeah.
What are the names of those species of bumblebees, if I may ask?
One of them is the Southern Plains bumblebee and the Western bumblebee.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Bombus insularis. Let me find the common name for that one. I believe it's the indiscriminate bumblebee. And then Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee.
Can you say that last one more time?
Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee.
Suckley's cuckoo?
Yeah.
Well, that is a fun name.
It is a fun name. Yeah. Cuckoo bumblebees are a little bit different. They're considered a parasite of bumblebees.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you go to nebraskabumblebeeatlas.org, you can find a bunch of information on the bumblebees in our state here.
Okay, but those are the 4 that are a little more endangered or we're keeping an eye on their population.
Yes, they're more threatened species.
Threatened.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Do you work or do you have in with like farmers who are using bumblebees to like pollinate their crops, whether vegetables or fruit or whatever? Do you work a lot with them, or do you know about like what's the impression? Like, are they seeing like a drop in bumblebees, or does that is pollinating a problem for them, or is it okay?
Pollinate, like growers that are using bumblebees in their greenhouses, they're generally doing that because bumblebees are more efficient at pollinating certain plants like tomatoes or peppers, just because of the way that that flower is. So bumblebees can do this interesting behavior called buzz pollination, where they sort of flip their body upside down and grab onto the flower and vibrate it so hard that pollen grains will fall out. And honeybees don't have the strength to do that. So greenhouses tend to use bumblebees because it pollinates their flowers a little bit more efficiently.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then they're buying bumblebees and
Yeah,
putting them in their
Yeah, there are species of bumblebees that are commercially reared. So they're also a managed pollinator. Um, there's a lot of research being done with them right now, as has been in the past 5 or 10 years, but there's been some associations that these commercially reared bumblebees have been spreading disease and pathogens to some of our wild populations, right? Because we're taking a species that's typically found in the eastern United States and introducing it into the West, and they're bringing over different parasites or pathogens that those bees haven't been exposed to before.
Sure. Do we have any bee farms in Nebraska?
I'm sure there are a couple that are using bumblebees somewhere.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't seen any questions come through online right now, but anyone can post a question if they'd like, or check out the Xerces Society. I'm sure you have a website that's full of great information,
Yep.
social media.
Xerces.org. Yep.
Yes, social media accounts if you're interested in learning more. Yeah, I think we'll wrap up for today. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for taking some time to talk with us today, Katie.
Of course.